We are the organizer of this webinar, and we will be recording this session. So if you would not like to be recorded, please feel free to turn your video off. Before we start, we would like to do some advertising work. SEDA Solar, this will be our first activity. We have 2 more activities lined up. Magna, can you share your screen? We have 1 more webinar in May given by Professor Gorkai Devishi. We have a physical visit to Harriet Watt Solar Testing Lab in October. So please feel free to follow our newsletter and social media. We will be posting more information on our social media soon and in our newsletter. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to Colin, who will be moderating the session. Colin, over to you.
Okay, yes, and I'd like to welcome, I believe there's quite a big audience tonight. It's a huge pleasure, I must say, to be able to introduce Daniel Barber, who's currently Professor and Head of School of Architecture at the University of Technology in Sydney, UTS as it's known, and with a considerable back history, I have to say, in the United States. So you'll recognise, I'm sure, from his accent, that back history. Daniel's one of a very limited number of architectural academics who recognise the pioneering merits of 20th century architects and scientists in developing what I would term climate-sensitive solar architecture. I first came across an article he'd written and had published in 2012, an MIT article, Le Corbusier, the Brise-Soleil and the Socio-Climatic Project of Modern Architecture, 1929 to 1963. So it's a specific time frame. After that, there followed his 2016 book, A House in the Sun, with the subtitle Modern Architecture and Solar Energy in the Cold War. And that followed a similar time frame to his 2012 article. And just to give that time frame a bit of a historical context, and well, the end part of that time frame, 1963, that coincided with a Hungarian architect who worked a lot in America during that period, Victor Olgier, with his twin brother, a seminal book, Design with Climate. And that's still used very much by students currently in schools of architecture. I do know that. In the same year, 63, the Inventory of World Resources of Buckminster Fuller was aired published that year, and it was also aired at a UIA Congress in Mexico, incidentally, a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it was quite an interesting period of history relative to the Cold War in the subtitle of Daniel's book. So, and then 4 years later, in his 2020 book, Modern Architecture and Climate Design, Before Air Conditioning, Daniel expands fulsomely on the themes of both his 2012 article and his 2016 book, still with solar design to the fore. And in all of his writings, he seamlessly weaves and references architectural design and solar science within the socio-political context of the period, a period that still has resonance and relevance today. So this evening, Daniel's provided the following, I think, rather intriguing title for his talk, Sustainable Architecture, the Sufficiency Imperative. And if anybody has questions as Daniel goes along, just please make use of the chat box. We'll go through as many as possible at the end of his presentation. So without more ado, over to you, Daniel.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that in-depth introduction and you know, the insistence on sort of keeping us attentive to the kind of broader socio-political issues that frame and inform the way that we think about architecture. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy to have this opportunity. Really interested in the discussion we might play out. I'm going to try to help us think together, I hope, about how we see the profession of architecture changing, how we kind of draw on some historical knowledge as a means to reimagine the architectural present and future, right? And it's a framing of a talk that, I mean, I guess I was going to say anxious, but actually kind of excited that I think many of you here as part of the association might have a bit more background or sort of context or sort of ways of thinking through some of these issues. So I'm really curious to have the chance to share this with you and see what sort of ideas it might spark and what sort of discussions we can get into. I'm going to take a second to share my screen. If you'll just give me 1 second to play a little game here. Let's see. I had this. Oh, sorry. To do it in the right order. Sorry. Seems like I should have this down by now, but so be it. And there we go. Okay, so I hope that. Okay, I hope that you're seeing the image and not the sort of whole screen. Yeah, we're good. Can I get a thumbs up from somebody that you?
It's full screen, yes.
But I mean, you just see the slide. You're not seeing all the
Yes.
kind of stuff around. Okay, great. So part of what I'm interested in thinking through is, in effect, how architects can sort of reclaim the mantle, if you will, or sort of see part of the purview of the field of the profession as one of being agents of transformation, right? And that, you know, that's the kind of large frame perspective that I want to start to put on the table. I'm going to get into, of course, a number of details. But in particular, how we can begin to think about the role for design and you know, as a professor and a head of school, the role for teaching design as one that's really about reframing the project of architecture to be that of decarbonization, right? So more than producing new buildings potentially in the world that surrounds us, working with the existing built environment to kind of leach the fossil fuels out of it, right? And so, you know, that's a present concern, that's a future concern, and part of what I want to get to after a little bit is get to some of these questions around the history that might help support some of those endeavors. But I want to start with I think it's going to be 2, maybe 3 preambles or sort of ways in, right? And again, this is part of where I'm really in part curious about your feedback on the assumption that some of you might be quite familiar with some of this material, but as a way to kind of start to locate and organize and kind of think about the sorts of discussions that are having an impact on architecture, which is to say not necessarily the discussions happening within architectural discourse, but the discussions that are kind of happening outside and are sort of coming to bear on what we do and how we think and imagine and sort of operate in this changing professional and social and economic environment. That might be a little more ambitious than what I'll be able to completely cover today, but it'll start to give us an idea. I wanted to start with talking through for a minute the IPCC report on the mitigation of climate change, not only because it's a project on the cover that I assume many of you are quite familiar with, given the context of this meeting. I should say I show this image and you know, these buildings to many other people, not only to those in Scotland, but I find it quite significant that the UN chose to use an image of a solar house of you know, a solar housing complex, an eco-village, on the cover of this project to rethink the kind of context for mitigation of climate change. And I'm sure that many of you know a lot of what the way that the UN has sort of been operating in this context, the way the IPCC has been operating is to talk about both adaptation to climate change and mitigation of climate change, right? Those become the 2 sort of poles for operation. And so this kind of focuses on mitigation, but will really be playing out, in a sense, both of them. So I'm going to dive into some of this for a minute. Sorry, I'm going to try to get it so this doesn't keep popping up. Oh, that's not going to work. Oh, well, just work with it. I'm going to dive into some issues from here for a minute as a kind of setting of the stage. And again, I anticipate that some of this will be quite familiar, and then we'll sort of move on to some more specifics that might be a bit less at your fingertips. But in this document, in this report from just about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago now, Yamina Saheb, who is one of the primary authors of the buildings chapter, the building industry chapter of this mitigation report, makes a few essential points, in a sense, again, sort of relative to what the broader socio-ecological discussion around climate change is kind of asking of architects, right? So it's, again, this kind of different set of social pressures. And I've summarized these in 3 points, right? The first one being that of the lock-in building, a sort of recognition that many buildings, if not most, if not all buildings that we produce today, I mean, obviously there's outliers and other experiments that are constantly going on, but the building industry, broadly considered, still very reliant on carbon, right? And that lock-in effect that the UN identifies is not only to suggest that in producing a building, designing and specifying a building that is still carbon dependent, not only are you still sort of widening the stream, right? And I'm holding my hands up high into the camera so you can see this kind of widening of the stream gesture. Not only are we widening the stream of fossil fuel dependence and not encouraging the sort of exploration of other means, but we're also locking in, right, the sort of broader set of issues and questions and energy systems and violence at extraction points and the fossil fuel, the pollution that emerges from shipping and refining and the sort of toxicities that circulate as part of the fossil fuel economy, right? So it's in part to say that the UN is, in a sense, kind of identifying the extent to which the built environment has become, or has been historically over the past 100 years or so, one of the primary physical and cultural media, which is to say, infrastructural systems of our built world, or of our social world, that has served in effect to kind of be a medium through which we draw resources out of the ground, process them in buildings, right, in mechanical plants and other things, and then emit those carbon emissions into the environment, right? So one could imagine any number of lock-in buildings to use as a sort of set of examples. I've been looking a little bit at this project in the kind of outskirts of Brussels, as again, as a kind of project that claims to be at the edge of a certain type of sustainable activity, and I'll be getting to that in a second, but that is nonetheless locking in these carbon effects, right, and sort of producing an ongoing dependence upon this fossil fuel system. And just to reiterate, right, that part of that lock-in effect is to suggest that not only does specifying carbon for a building project encourage fuels to continue to flow to the building itself, but it's just a sort of broader question that says it locks in that bigger system, right? And part of what Yamina Saheb, again, the author of some of this, and others of us have been trying to really clarify, how can we initiate and challenge and resist some of that lock-in effect, and how can we initiate other sorts of systems and other sorts of investigations, which is to say that, fuel, it remains available and almost too freely available. And one of the things that we want to begin to consider is how we can kind of, shift that tide, right, and explore different types of energy systems and their ready availability. So that's the first point. And again, I'm doing this far too quickly, to just sort of get some of these issues on the table, but might help us kind of, get our heads in the same place. The second point that the IPCC document, that the mitigation document makes, is again the sort of core of the kind of way of thinking I want to introduce tonight, which is the difference between sufficiency and efficiency, right? And again, this is maybe something that some of you know in some technical detail, or at least perhaps tacitly or passively, so to speak. What we know, one of the things that this helps us to understand is that the project of sustainable architecture, and I like to use this building that's now, what, almost 40 years old, as a kind of example of the types of buildings that are produced under the name of sustainability. This, of course, being an early one that, again, I assume most of you are quite familiar with. Sustainable architecture, green architecture, has relied upon the premise of efficiency, right? That we can produce the same basic product, provide the same services, but we can do so in slightly different ways, right? We can nuance the conditions of energy use a little bit, but it's not a transformative project. It's a sort of inflection, right? It's a sort of slight distinction. What Saheb and her colleagues point out in this mitigation report is that looking back at the history of sustainable architecture, again, since about this moment, approximately in the mid-1980s, what her group has determined is that all of the savings in carbon emissions that have resulted from this efficiency set of interventions and ambitions has been overwhelmed by just building more, right? So we're building more efficiently since circa 1985, but we're just building more square meters, more square footage for individuals in their homes, for office spaces, community spaces, institutions, schools, colleges, malls, right? We just sort of keep that building industry churning, and that has in effect overwhelmed the savings in carbon emissions, right? So when you note, as many of you I'm sure do, that emissions from the building industry are still going up, right? Even though we've been trying so hard, or some of us, to resist that, even though emissions are still going up, in part because even though we've developed ways to build very efficiently, we haven't developed ways to resist that kind of impulse to insert a new building into the built environment when we might be better off reusing something from the past, right? So this basic premise that the sort of almost kind of religion of efficiency that's come to take over the sustainable discussion has led to some very refined and important technological developments, but in its kind of, the large kind of historical view helps us to understand that it's really not changing the game, right? Not the transformative intervention that we need. Saheb defines sufficiency as follows. Sufficiency is a set of policy measures and daily practices which avoid the demand for energy and materials, et cetera, while still delivering well-being, right? So avoiding the demand is one of the essential pieces there, right? Which, again, much sustainable architecture doesn't try to do. But I think even more so, this kind of phrase here of policy measures and daily practices, and part of what I want to be playing out today is how architecture, in my mind, is really sitting at that intersection, right? Is sort of mediating between policy and sort of government activity and regulatory activity, and then the kind of daily practices of individuals and how they kind of also relate to these potentials for a certain type of transformation to our built environment, to our energy systems, to our ways of life, to our sort of carbon accounts, if you will. Okay, so that's the second point. Again, moving a bit quickly. The third point, is in part sort of what we're doing here today, what I assume the association is doing in much of its work, which is recognizing that this decade, and as the UN puts it, this is the sort of critical period for upskilling, right? That as architects, as designers, as in people engaged in the built environment, we have the task, and again, I take this on very directly as a professor and as an administrator of an educational institution. We have the obligation to think about what we're teaching, the types of skills and aptitudes we're providing, not only to students, but to existing architects in offices and the sorts of ongoing training that's available for them, how we can really see this next decade as the decade of upskilling and reskilling and reimagining what the kind of work is that gets done within an architecture firm, so as to, again, shepherd in this transformation, right? So all of these, in effect, helping us to realize, I hope, or to sort of get on the table that part of what we're talking about when we talk about architecture today is my sort of basic proposal, is we're talking about how to develop skills for decarbonization, right? How to see architects as agents of decarbonization in the built environment, as a quite distinct profession, right? As quite distinct, that is, from simply or focusing on the production of the built environment. Okay, so that's kind of the first sort of introduction or preamble. The second is to focus some of that discussion more directly on the question of comfort, right? And on the relationship between climate control systems and the comfort they provide. This is the HVAC system in the Noy Institute in Rotterdam, one of hundreds, thousands, millions maybe of similar systems around the world, hidden from view. This is in the basement. Sometimes they're on the roof. Part of what I'm really interested in understanding is how we can begin to develop strategies for historical analysis, as I've been trying to do, and certainly for design intervention, that kind of surface the presence of these systems, make them a part of our discussion, make them a part of our sort of formal approach, make them a part of our sense of culture that architecture is concerned to introduce and engage. So here's one moment where that started to happen, a slightly complicated one, and I'd be happy to kind of play out some of the details. But at the Biennale organized by Rem Koolhaas and OMA in 2014, as you walked into the Elements exhibition, right, you saw this sort of drop ceiling revealing all of this material below it, right? So again, a sort of moment, albeit in this case, a relatively symbolic one, right, where we are kind of revealing and understanding all the other stuff that goes on, right? And when I give these kind of talks in person, I pause at this moment so we can all listen to the air conditioner that's often almost always humming within the auditorium, right? And just kind of recognize again that we are subject to these conditions, the sort of the built environment that is really no longer fit to purpose for the types of lives that we might want to lead, right? So air conditioning and this relationship between mechanical systems and the comfort they provide is in my mind the real nexus for this set of sufficiency interventions, right? How can we begin to think about ways of building and ways of living and ways of operating that don't rely on these systems, that render these systems obsolete, right? Or at least to the extent possible, so that we can imagine not only different ways of building, but different ways of living in a post-carbon future. I'll just throw in one other kind of UN moment here before I move on, to indicate, and this is from a more recent report, when we're talking about that future, I mean, and again, I'm assuming that this is a group that maybe doesn't need this sort of reminder, but I think it's always important to just sort of keep us tightly focused on the challenges that we face, right? We're talking about the future for our children and grandchildren and students and colleagues that is getting increasingly hot, that is getting increasingly unpredictable in terms of its climate conditions. And this drawing, diagram developed by the UN more recently, I think it was just earlier this year or maybe the end of last year, really starts to indicate that, how bad it's going to get for an individual, given kind of when they were born and how they might operate. And of course, this needs to be run through according to geography, according to economic class, according to many other issues that amplify the inequities that are at stake in these discussions. But nonetheless, sort of gives us a sense of the urgency of the situation. So just to zoom out for a second then, and to think through some of the general ways that I've tried to take on some of these questions, and then I'll get into some specific narratives. Colin very generously noted these two books. I'm happy to connect people to PDFs of them, although of course the physical object is quite delicate and delicious. Deep historical analyses rooted out of archival research that has, quite literally tried to reveal some of these other practices, and I'll be looking through a few of those in a moment. But I just wanted to also put on the table, and happy to cycle back to this in questions, that a lot of the work I've been doing more recently over the past couple of years, in addition to my institutional work, has been around trying to really spark and encourage a discussion for how we think about living beyond fossil fuel conditioned systems, right? So I wrote an essay in 2019 called After Comfort, and that sparked a certain amount of discussion, which has since led to this series on Eflux Architecture, which is a very vibrant online platform that has invited individuals from around the world. And this is a few of the early ones. We're now up to, I think, number 16. So I guess exactly double what we're seeing here. They're coming out every 2 weeks. Essays, poems, projects, some of them are a bit more scholarly, some of them are a bit more almost even kind of fictional or journalistic, helping us to kind of think through the sort of tactics and strategies that not only imagine different ways of life in the future, but recognize how much those ways of life are drawing on the past, right? So I'll point you just for a second to this project by Alexander Kedziorek, a Polish curator, who has done some really interesting research on the patterns and practices in the north of Poland, quite cold area, a quite cold region of the country, where there's been a practice of basically adding thick textiles, kind of thicker than curtains, not quite a blanket, right, but a kind of substantive thermal barrier to the roofs, to the walls, sometimes even in hallways as sort of passageways, sort of clothing the home in the winter as things get cold, and then, of course, taking it back off in the summer as the world warms up around it. So just one of many examples, many of them drawing from historical practices to think about how we can be using things differently in the future. But it starts to suggest another point that will help me to clarify some of the material I want to talk through now, which is that part of what we're facing and sort of struggling with, and in some cases kind of celebrating, is that a lot of the strategies and tactics from before the fossil fuel era are now again relevant to our strategies and tactics today. So when we, one of the things this does is really complicate or confuse some of the strategies for historical knowledge and the production of historical research. Historians tend to not get too caught up in the present and the future, right? Our job is to understand the sort of causal dynamics of the past. But I think as we bracket, or as we, I guess, kind of optimistically bracket the period from, let's say, 1920 to 2020 as a period of fossil fuel profligacy, right? And I like to use the word profligacy because you have to kind of spit it out as if you're spewing oil around the world, right? This century of fossil fuel profligacy, we see that a lot of the strategies and techniques, practices and design methods that were evident and active before circa 1920, right, can be sort of toyed with and engaged and thought through again as we reemerge from this period of kind of fossil fuel dominance. Now, that period, circa 1920, also one of the sort of early moments of the flowering of architectural modernism, right? And one of the aspects of the research that I've been playing out over the past decade or two has been trying to kind of reassess those principles of modernism to understand how climate and environmental issues were essential to these kinds of discussions. So what I'm going to do now is just go through a few kind of quick examples, case studies, episodes in these different histories, kind of drawn from across the two books and some other research that I've been doing, just to put some of these strategies on the table, right? But again, before I jump in, and I'll give you this image to look at while I'm talking this through. Before I jump in, I do want to be a bit delicate about this question of sort of the usable past, right? And how we think about past practices and play them out in the future. The philosopher Kate Soper, perhaps familiar to some of you, has used this sort of tantalizing phrase, what she calls avant-garde nostalgia, right? And now this is not in an architectural context, right? We are familiar with, and I think often resisting, nostalgia for the avant-garde, right? Which is not what she's talking about, but rather a notion that we go back to the past and reflect upon it pleasantly, right? This is the kind of nostalgia part. Think about the ways that things have operated, but at the same time have a critical sort of forward-looking perspective, the kind of avant-gardist piece that allows us to look at those tools and strategies and tactics, and again, think about how they might play a role in our present and near future. So a sort of hearkening back, or sort of wistfully looking back to previous practices, but then trying to understand them in a present context, which is to say on somewhat different terms. So I want to look pretty quickly at this project, a project by Le Corbusier, a set of drawings. This was not built, a small set of housing units in the periphery of Barcelona that was proposed in the early 1930s. And just to kind of talk through it for a minute, I assume you can see my cursor as I'm kind of circling a few things. A pretty simple proposal, blocks of 3 units connected, as you can see, in some ways in a sort of cruciform arrangement. This ground floor has this kind of opening that might look to us like a garage today, right? But in its intention was really meant to be a sort of open space, a kind of space for sociability, sort of like the elevated balconies, kind of indoor-out spaces in the unité d'habitation that we're all familiar with, but rather at the ground level, kind of at the neighborhood level. But this opening, this kind of social space, right, had a couple of different roles to play. And if I can move to this section, and I'll show a section that shows this a little more clearly in a second, but it's a bit harder to read. We see that also, part of this opening is about kind of allowing for a kind of passage of air, right? I'm in a very simple and straightforward ventilation system that could draw the air from the ground floor and bring it through the space. I'll go ahead and jump to the other slide that does this in a bit more of a fun way. This is an early sketch from the same project. And I don't know how well you can see it. I'm going to actually turn up my screen a little bit. There we go. You can see the kind of very early version of these kind of blue wind direction arrows. They're not arrows, they're just lines, but they're kind of thicker at one end than another. So you kind of get a sense of motion, right? We get this sense of the capacity for wind to pass through the space and ventilate these different aspects. And we also see, and I'm a bit obsessed about this guy up here, who I've now decided is a butterfly catcher. I thought he might be a beekeeper for a while, but I zoomed into some of those little dots above his head, and I'm pretty sure they're intending to be butterflies. The sense, as Le Corbusier was often playing out, of how the kind of transformations of the built environment are also transformations in lifestyle, transformations of our relationship to nature, l'esprit nouveau, right? This different way of life. So some of that is reflected not only in the greenery on the roof and this kind of insistence on natural ventilation, this use of a kind of wind tower in effect, but also as we see in this gentleman enjoying himself walking across the lantern at the top. If I'll can just spend one more minute with this building as a kind of introduction to some of the other discussions. One of the things that it suggests for us, and this model was actually built much later for the Cité de Patrimoine in Paris as part of an exhibition. I think it was in 2006. We see, of course, these shading systems, right? We see that Le Corbusier is deploying a movable set of louvers, right, that can be changed and adjusted as the sun, as the path of the sun goes over the sky, over the seasons, or over the day. And part of what I get kind of obsessed about in the Modern Architecture and Climate book is this little bit right here, where we see him drawing them first, in their 4 different stages, right? 4 different kind of states of rest, either fully horizontal, fully vertical, or in the 2 different diagonal versions. And it's, evidence again of a sort of struggle representationally to kind of demonstrate and identify the sort of dynamism that's available in that sort of shading louver system, right? I'm gonna park that for a second and return to it after I go through one other set of projects. But it's in part just to suggest that the skills and the tools again and the aptitudes that were being articulated and played out in this moment were not just about design. We're not just about thinking through the ventilation dynamics and the climatic aptitudes, climatic conditions of this building, but really trying to see the building, see the project of architecture as producing a term that I've developed based on some of the archival work that I've seen of Le Corbusier, see the building as a device for climatic adaptability, right? The part of the project of modernism, insofar as it sort of divorced itself or saw itself as moving past a lot of these customary and traditional practices, which, as we know, were often quite climatically sound, quite climatically astute. As we enter into the modern period and the materials and the systems and methods that it entails, we see Korb and many others that we'll look through trying to understand how to take advantage of these tools, take advantage of these systems and methods as a means to sort of produce a sort of dynamic system for the building that's, not only a machine for living in, right? Of course, we're all familiar with that trope, but rather a kind of system or a device that allows us to kind of adjust and relate to different climates as they change in the world outside. Okay, that's episode 1. I want to jump to another for just a second, and then cycle back to a third before concluding. I want to look for a second at this house, and it's a house, again, I hope maybe known to some of you, the Dover Sun House, designed by Maria Telkish and Eleanor Raymond in 1947. A really complicated and ambitious solar house, intended to be, as some of the promotional material that we see here indicates, the world's first sun-heated home, right? Now, maybe the more astute of you are saying, well, wait a second. There was a few centuries, perhaps, when the sun was being used to heat homes, right? So we're really already seeing that this is a suggestion that says this is the world, in the kind of modern period, in the kind of industrial or post-war period. This was kind of the first attempt to produce a living environment in a relatively cold climate of the northeastern U.S. Without any mechanical system, right, or without a familiar sort of furnace-based heating system. Again, it's a complicated project. I'll sort of cycle back from the end to suggest that it didn't really work very well, but it was an important experiment. This entire bank of what might look like a kind of set of windows on a glorious art studio at the top are not windows at all, and they don't allow light in. Rather, it's a solar collection system, and you can see it sort of diagrammed here. Black carbon painted sheets of metal that were intended to heat up as much as possible and collect a lot of hot air in this sort of panel volume. And then as that air heated up, it would be in the daytime, it would be distributed to phase change materials that were in these heat bins, as they called them, these sort of canisters of chemical solution, spread throughout the house in a number of kind of strategically located places. Those chemical solutions would change phase as they absorbed that heat, right? And then as the air cooled around them in the evening, they would change phase again in order to release the heat, right? So a very simple, well, at least a non-mechanical, chemically based solar heat storage system, right? That allowed the sun to sort of gather that heat during the day and then release it in the evening. Talkish's ambition was to allow it to be, again, fully heated by this system over multiple days of little sunlight in a frigid northeastern winter. And again, that's kind of where, well, that's one of the places where it fell apart. The occupants of the house were cousins of Maria Talkish and were quite sympathetic to the cause, if you will. There's stories of a few nights when they got so cold they had to all sleep on the kitchen floor and turn on the oven, right, to kind of heat their space. So a number of complications. There's Amelia Peabody, who was the sculptor and I guess a socialite who was funding the house, as she put it in 1953 when they decided to stop the experiment. They've proven that solar living is possible, but not very comfortable, right? So we're sort of back to this question of comfort and sort of how we kind of reimagine our relationship to it. I'll just say very quickly, the other kind of problem that doomed the project was that super high heat environment that collected, in between these glass panels and the carbon black painted metal behind. It got really hot. It dried out all of the sealants and the caulks, right? So every summer they had to take the whole system down, clean it all out, put the glass back up and reseal it, right? It was really not an especially efficient project, but it was an experiment, right? It was a well-funded experiment that was intended to sort of explore possibilities. And again, I anticipate some of you might be quite familiar with the use of phase change materials that persists into the present. Talkish was quite an interesting engineer and explorer, and working with a lot of different architects. There's actually a great documentary on Talkish called The Sun Queen that came out on PBS, on the U.S. public television channel. I think it came out about a year ago. Yeah, so she's quite a figure, not only for her kind of intelligence and acumen, but also for her advocacy of solar practices. And I just want to look at a few other projects that she was involved in. This is a solar wall that she and Aladar Ogyai designed, intended to be sort of a standalone system that, they kind of imagined almost a sort of truck that could drive through the suburbs and sort of hawk their wares right to the solar incline that might be surrounding them. A system quite similar in principle to the one I was just describing, a wall that collects radiation, right? And then a kind of extended space that stores it in various forms of chemical and other heat storage solutions. And you can see they're trying to identify, you can either you can kind of paste the wall onto an existing south-facing wall and it can emanate the heat directly, or it can sort of carry that heat into the interior through these different diagrammatic means, right? This was played out in a number of different elaborate ways, but this diagram helps to sort of clarify some of the basic principles. Telkish was also involved in the production of something that it's a bit tricky to see up here in the top left. I hope you can get some sense of it on your screens. An entire sort of complex for solar research that was built in the late 1950s for the Curtiss-Wright Corporation. You can see the various sort of solar cookers and solar panels. A lot of her interest actually, Telkish's sort of main entry point into solar energy had to do with finding ways to desalinate water through solar means, right? In particular, as a project, she developed a device so that during the war, pilots that got shut down over the ocean could have a kind of raft that was also a kind of solar heat-based desalination unit, right? So they could have drinkable water while they were waiting to get picked up. That carried itself out into a number of other experiments. We see a few of them here. But really the point is that, and this was built, the pictures of it are not worth kind of looking at. They weren't taken very, very carefully, but you can see in this drawing by Aladar Ogyay, this research center was built in Princeton, not in relationship to the university, but quite near it in the late 1950s as a means to really kind of elaborate some of those solar potentials. Telkish was in this moment also affiliated off and on with MIT. MIT had a number of different solar houses. This is their fourth, which I think is in many ways, not only the most interesting one in terms of its design, but part of what we're seeing here is the sort of, let's say, cultural intervention that was also at stake, right? You're not just going to live in a solar house. You're also going to have a kind of solar barbecue and grill your hot dogs out on this system, right? And this is Lawrence Anderson, who was the dean of MIT during this period, right? A prominent architect and something of a scholar, interested in thinking about, again, not only sort of the mechanical systems, the solar systems that could replace other forms of mechanical systems to provide adequate heat in the frigid Boston winter, but also how the kind of prospect for solar energy to really sort of transform lifestyles more broadly. Here's another image of that house. I tended to photograph it in the winter. And this house worked quite well for about a decade. And in this case, the reason that it sort of stopped working, and again, the panel was removed and replaced with just a standard roof, insulated roof, was that whenever there was a problem with this house, the occupants would call the professors at MIT, right? Which is to say there was no sort of infrastructure or industry that was around to service and support these systems. There weren't endless kind of vans driving around the city as I see in Sydney, repairing air conditioners as the summer heats up, right? There wasn't that sort of industrial infrastructure. And frankly, the professors at MIT just got a little sick of it. Often they didn't know how to solve the problem, or they just kind of didn't want to deal with it, right? So it kind of collapsed by virtue of a just kind of lack of a broader, again, kind of industrial culture that could support it. And we all know, either precisely or more generally, that this was also the period of wild oil proliferation, right? Of mechanical and military and diplomatic means by which the US in particular extracted as much oil as possible from the Middle East, from Venezuela, began to distribute it as part of the so-called American century, right? Building up its economic potential at the same time as sort of controlling these energy regimes, which is just to say there wasn't a lot of domestic, after this early kind of 1950s period, there wasn't a lot of domestic kind of ambition to bring solar energy into the kind of energy mix of the US. And as one of the figures in this period put it, most of the solar energy experiments of the time were overwhelmed by the flood of oil, right? That was coming in from above, that was coming in from all over the world, right? In effect. Okay, so a number of two quick episodes. I'm gonna jump into a slightly more elaborate one as a way to kind of think through some of these issues, in particular around comfort and sufficiency and the kind of possibilities for a different kind of architecture of the future. Again, drawn from a very specific set of historical examples of historical patterns. So I want to sort of comparatively analyze these two buildings for a minute, right? And it gives us a chance, I think, to think through some of the important issues at play. The building on the left is one that might be known to some of you, designed by Pietro Belushi, actually also faculty at MIT in that same, off and on in that same period that we were just looking at and before the war. then having moved to Portland, Oregon in the northwest of the US. And let me just jump into a sort of close-up on the facade and a room in the interior. The Equitable building was of the first to have been designed with a fully sealed curtain wall, right? As you can see in the interior view, there was no opening these windows without these, this kind of ventilation system and heating and cooling system. There would be no way to even enter into this room, right? I mean, no way to occupy the building without the support of a fossil fueled HVAC system. Now, again, this was built in 1947. As many of you know, whether you saw Oppenheimer or not, right, the kind of questions around energy in the immediate post-war period were quite dynamic. Portland, Oregon is just below the border of Washington State. Washington State is the home of the Boeing Aircraft Company, back in the news today, but was in the news in the late 1940s, right after the war, insofar as they had kind of, Boeing was essential to the wartime effort, to the production of all sorts of planes and other sorts of metal devices, required a lot of energy to kind of ramp up dial up its production of aircraft and other things. And after the war, there was a sort of question in effect of what to do with this, what was effectively a surplus of energy, right? And the way that Belushi put it in his discussions with the Equitable insurance company, with the client, was that they wanted to find a way to take advantage of this surplus and continue the state of emergency, that's a quote, continue the state of emergency that wartime efforts have brought about, right? So, we could make a lot of that question of the state of emergency, but the main point is that, as the sort of flow of energy increased during the war, part of the project of buildings, this building in particular, and many others like it, and we'll see a few, part of the project of buildings was to use as much of that energy as possible, right? Was to widen that stream, right? And again, I am in no way trying to suggest that this suggests that Belushi wasn't a great architect or, kind of pointing fingers. This was in fact the brief, right? The project of architecture in the post-war period was to use as much energy as possible, right? That was a means to increase economic activity. That was a means to increase, in the case of this building and this building, increase the economic position of the United States in relationship to other powers, right? It was very explicitly intended, as a means to, again, kind of widen that flow and increase that flow, widen the stream, maintain as much sort of economic flow as possible. So in a building such as this, in many ways, schematically quite similar to the Equitable building that we just saw. Again, a building I anticipate all of you are familiar with, the Seagram's Tower, which, as you also know, I assume has a very thin curtain wall. You even see these heating registers kind of right on the edge. When the Energy Star Corporation in 2009 did an analysis of all of the Midtown Manhattan high-rises to kind of assess which ones were most appropriate for a certain type of energy retrofit, they ranked them all on 0 to 100 relative to their environmental performance, and the Seagram's Tower came in at a 3, right? So 3 on a scale of 0 to 100, not so great. A lot of the kind of anonymous or sort of not so interesting mid-1980s buildings around the corner that just had much less glazing, came in the 60s and 70s. So it's again a kind of recognition in a moment, and my reference to Oppenheimer a minute ago was in part because Strauss, the kind of evil person who loses out at the end, sorry if you haven't seen it, was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission in this moment. And this was, right in 57, 58, when this was being built, was when he famously said that energy will soon be too cheap to meter, right? And this was on the assumption that nuclear energy would soon proliferate around the world. It didn't quite happen on the scale that he anticipated, but nonetheless, too cheap to meter in the sense that, it would just be free and easy to kind of dial up as much energy use as you wanted, right? So again, the contexts are radically different, right? I mean, we're just sort of talking through and thinking about how these different buildings had the capacity to sort of reimagine the energy system in a markedly different direction than what we're trying to imagine today. And the last point I'll make before going to the other sort of side of the comparison, this is again that interior that we saw before. I'm cheating a little bit. This is the interior of the UN headquarters building in Manhattan. again, maybe you can envision the tower itself, but part of what I want to just emphasize for a second is that the way in which that heating kind of met the user, kind of engaged with those who were trying to produce comfort in those interiors, right, was through a knob, was through a thermostat. Today it's maybe through your phone or your watch or through some sort of digital mechanism, but it's a disembodied, it's a physically alienated relationship to the climate that surrounds us in the interior, right, to the thermal environment in which we live. Okay, so trying to get, again, as I suggested, a number of different things on the table. I hope to spark some good discussion. To go quickly to the other side of this slide on the right, the other comparative project. This is a building by the firm Emi Hubertu. Two of the M's, three brothers. Two of them were trained by Lucio Costa. The other was a little younger, came through a different formation. But we begin to see, a very different approach. And again, we can see it a bit in the section. I kind of skipped over the section and looking at this one, in part because it's kind of not that interesting, right? It's a whole bunch of systems that are allowing the window unit, the double glazed window, to be as sealed as possible. Whereas what we see on the right is something a bit more dynamic, and harkening back already to the Corbusier project that we saw a few minutes ago, and in some ways in direct relationship to it. I'll just zoom in for us a little bit. And part of what we see here is that the architect, the designer, brings into the project a sort of script or almost a choreography, right, to kind of produce a set of relationships between the inside and the outside, right? They kind of render, not only kind of articulate this dynamic facade, but sort of implicate the individual in a very different set of interactions, right? So you might imagine that they would sort of, someone living in this space might open the sash in the morning to let in some fresh morning air if they so desired. During the hot sun at noon, they always had these fixed vanes to keep the sun out. You could drop down that sunscreen at 6 if you wanted to sit back and relax and enjoy your caipirinha. A number of different sort of adjustable systems, right, that allowed you to modulate your experience of that interior. And the Hubertu brothers were quite prolific in these sorts of strategies, and showing not only building these kinds of buildings that had a lot of solar shading and a lot of other kind of interventions relative to their climatic performance, but as we see in this image on the right, sort of using them for promotional purposes, right? I mean, taking photographs of themselves, moving these screens around. Kind of, this was kind of their thing. Their kind of niche market, right? Was these residential towers and office buildings such as this one that developed through that sort of came alive through their climate, their dynamic climate systems. This is another one of my favorites, also built for an insurance company, where you can just get a sense of the many different ways that you can sort of move these shading systems around, and the different sort of bits and pieces that allowed you to think through this building more carefully, think through this building's climatic relationship more carefully. A lot of this material in the period was rooted in technological experimentation and the work of engineers. So these architects and others in Rio were in direct conversation with people such as Santos Werneck and Paulo Sá, meteorologists kind of avant la lettre, right? Kind of before, well, that had been developing in certain circles, but they wouldn't have claimed that mantle. Examining the climate of Rio and doing so in such a way so as to see how buildings could be a sort of medium again through which to bring sort of the benefits of modern life to the people of Brazil, right? So we just see a few of these to get a sense of that. I think I'm already pretty close to being out of time, so I want to do just two more quick things, I guess 1.5 maybe, which is first to kind of note that, part of what I'm interested in when I talked about that sort of bracket, right, and that kind of 1920 to 2020 and before air conditioning and after air conditioning, and how we want to start thinking about the world of the future. One of the things that disrupts is the sort of modern premise of a progressive trajectory, a trajectory of progressive development, right? And we see, as we look back to these buildings that I was just talking us through, albeit far too quickly, that they've already gone through a second phase, right? So these are these same buildings from Brazil in the period, photographed more recently, where those delicate shading systems that I just celebrated were stripped out, right? Taken off, in this case, completely, replaced by these little kind of pockmarked air conditioning units, right? And it tells us a few things. I mean, it tells us on the one hand that, in fact, those shading devices, relative to the power of a fossil fueled air conditioner, were not very effective, right? They were kind of weak relative to the flow of fossil fuels, so that as individuals, as the sort of global economic environment in particular started to transform, the standards or the expectations of the comfort of the interior also transformed, right? Which is to say that it might have been fine in the 1940s and 50s, but by the 80s and 90s, there was a different set of desires, a different set of aspirations for how to experience that interior, right? And I say that in part because I think this image, and I mean, we could jump to the next one, which is a version of the same thing, helps us to realize that air conditioning has conditioned us, right? As individuals, as sort of occupants of these spaces, we have become accustomed to anticipating, if not quite a universal state of comfort, a consistent experience of the built interior in many of our urban buildings, in many of our institutional buildings, in some cases in our domestic buildings. We've come to anticipate that we can sort of walk into pretty much any space around the world and, be able to turn on not any space around the world, I should say, very unevenly distributed and inequitably distributed around the world, but nonetheless able to sort of, flip a switch or turn a knob and sort of produce the comfort that we're after, right? So it helps us to see that. But it also helps us to see that, we face these limits, right? And as we try to kind of reimagine our relationship to comfort, and I'll sort of jump back to this slide to start to conclude, as we start to reimagine our relationship to comfort, part of what we see is that not only do we have the kind of tools and skills technically and in terms of our sort of architectural elaborations, but we also, have the physiologies and the adaptive systems and the kind of capacities for new desires, right? That also allow us to think about comfort in very dynamic ways, right? Comfort is a term that's very difficult to define. As it was defined by ASHRAE, by the kind of regulatory body that sort of manages the conditions of thermal comfort in many buildings around the world, comfort is the state of not being uncomfortable. Right. It's a bit frustrating on the one hand, but it's, it's capacious, it's open, it allows for some points of intervention. We all know perhaps intuitively when we do or don't feel comfortable, but it's in part to recognize that it's a malleable thing, it's a contingent thing. It's not a kind of universal system, a universal norm, but rather a sort of set of aspirations and a set of desires. And the point I want to end with is that when we talk about comfort and when we anticipate its demise, right, and the sort of moving past comfort into a different world, I want to insist that we're really talking about a very specific group of people, right? And you may know that the group of geologists has just determined that we are not in the Anthropocene, right? I don't know if this kind of news has come across your desks, but they rejected the premise of the Anthropocene on the basis that it is not anthropos, it is not the species that has produced this transformation, right? But it is very specific aspects of the species, very specific people and their capacity to consume energy and produce carbon emissions that has complicated our atmospheric system. So we're really talking about how those of us who have benefited from a century of fossil fuels and the comfort that it provides now have the capacity to reimagine our futures, right? To reinflect our possible futures, to think about sufficient modes of operation that require not only less space potentially and less of a built environment, but certainly less comfort, right? And I think part of the project for architects today is to think about how we can design for discomfort, right? Again, for those people that have benefited from profligate fossil fuels over the past few decades, so that those who have not can have the capacity to self-actualize and build their lives and maintain the kind of public health that some of these mechanisms have also brought about. I'll leave it there and open myself to questions, and really curious to hear your thoughts.
Unmute myself. Thank you so much, Daniel. Yes, I'm sure that that presentation's probably encouraged a lot of people to put questions in. I'll just have a look at where is it? The chat. There's 3 in, at least at the moment, it would seem.
Oh, I think I might be able to see it too. Okay. Oh boy. Okay.
Yeah. Where are we? Yes.
Okay. I don't know that anybody's inserted a question. I'm happy to take them.
Chris Morgan's
Adaptive
got a
comfort.
question.
Yeah.
Sounds
Yeah.
like a lot of overlap with ideas on adaptive comfort. Any comment?
Right. Absolutely. And, I think one of the difficulties in this sort of discussion is that there's, of course, many brilliant and effective researchers that are looking at these issues from lots of different directions, right? And I think on the one hand, we recognize that the sort of universal conditions of comfort that ASHRAE and that other systems have sort of insisted on over the decades is a very narrow spectrum, right? Is a very narrow piece of what's maybe available, and that indeed ideas around adaptive comfort and a recognition that different genders, different ethnicities, different ages all have different relationships to the thermal interior and can kind of bring different expectations to it. So on the one hand, adaptive comfort as a sort of model for understanding that there's a lot of different ways to experience the interior, right? There's a lot of different ways to feel comfortable within a space. But I think one of the cautions that I often raise around the question of adaptive comfort is that I think that part of what we're struggling with, again, back to this premise of efficiency and sufficiency, and the kind of built-in or the sort of lock-in logic, in many cases, and of course there's important exceptions, but in many cases, this premise of adaptive comfort is still dependent upon fossil fueled HVAC systems, right? It's using them much more carefully and much more dynamically, and again, producing some efficiencies, but is still sort of reliant upon this sort of broad technical trajectory that has allowed us, that has sort of been something of a permission structure for business as usual, right? Something of a means to sort of keep going in the same ways that we've been accustomed to, rather than the sorts of transformations that I think we might anticipate are coming quite quickly, right, to our broader social world.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that comment, Daniel, that not necessarily fossil fuel. We are now sinking to a point, particularly in Scotland versus the whole of the UK, actually, that we have a lot of renewable energy in Scotland. And so what we need probably more of, we're producing quite a lot of renewable electricity. We probably need more renewable heat. What we haven't done is what they've done in various Scandinavian countries in particular, but other European countries had large fields of solar thermal collectors, and the infrastructure linking that often to other renewable forms like biomass. And so you have a whole small town or village heated.
Yeah, and I think some of the challenges there, I mean, again, I spend a lot of time with my students playing out the distinctions between embodied carbon and operational carbon, right? And I assume these are terms that are familiar to most of you here. But it really becomes a challenge insofar as in the US, there's a big discussion about decarbonizing the grid, right? And, we could talk about how well it's going. But one of the things that's done is led to a lot of architectural discussions where there's a kind of premise that says, okay, we're going to figure out how to decarbonize the grid. So, I mean, I'm overstating it, of course, speaking far too schematically. But since we know how to decarbonize the grid, let's not worry about operational energy, right? We'll assume that the kind of decarbonized grid will allow us to take advantage of that electric power in ways that can allow us to, to cool our buildings and heat them as needed to make them comfortable. Instead, we'll focus on the embodied energy, right? We'll focus on the kind of embodied energy aspects, reduce those as much as possible in such a way as to reduce carbon emissions in the moment, right? So it's in part to suggest that by, sometimes that's the right balance, right? Sometimes it's not, and the different projects, of course, demand different things. But I think that there's a sort of overarching premise that part of what's hard for us is to kind of shift our technological trajectory, right? To shift our foundation of knowledge and to kind of not only think about how we can use a different set of tools more efficiently, but how we can, really just sort of get away with using less, right? And I think that, again, the comfort, the thermal conditions of the interior are a place where that plays out very directly. And what is the limit, right? How can we operate in such a way that we're just comfortable enough, right? I gave a related lecture in Brussels a few months ago, and there was a relatively older individual there. I would say he's in his 60s or 70s. And he asked a question. Well, he didn't ask a question. He raised his hand at the end to let us know that he had trained himself to spend his time in his house in the winter at about 12 degrees, right? So to sort of maintain a 12-degree temperature throughout the winter. And, we all sort of gasped, right? Thought that was a bit extreme. And he said the only problem was nobody ever wants to come visit him, right? But yeah, how do we begin to kind of think about our own aptitudes and capacities, and not to say we should all live at 12 degrees, but in the American context in particular, but we can find versions of it elsewhere. One can live their whole lives in air conditioning, right? And so how we begin to kind of recognize the costs and benefits of some of those issues. Oh, we have a 12-degreer right here in the room. Congratulations. Yeah. I mean, that's daunting to me, living at 12 degrees, but hats off to you.
No, I mean, interestingly, my experience of some air-conditioned buildings is that they overcool. So you're quite liable to get, in the summer, walking into an air-conditioned atmosphere, something near 12 degrees.
Absolutely.
And, yeah, and there's a whole psychology around it. And so it's a good question, this whole issue of adaptive comfort. I see Nick now. What are you asking? Nick Downey.
There's a few things in here.
You like a Northern Hemisphere sufficiency shout out to Siam contributor
Yeah,
Erskine. And peak shots with passive ventilation and comfort.
Yeah, so this is kind of similar actually to a follow-up that from Chris's question above, where he followed up and asked about the sort of challenge of making the pitch, right? Which is to say, and maybe even as an architect, I'm not sure if Chris is an architect, but one of the questions that often comes up, how do you convince somebody to experience less comfort, right? How do you sort of sell the premise of discomfort? And indeed, the title of the book that I'm working on that kind of summarizes some of this material, I'm calling it, well, my title for it, we'll see what the editor thinks, is come on in, make yourself uncomfortable, right? There's the kind of contradictions quickly emerge, and I think that on the one hand, it's to say that for the haves, if I can be so schematic and sort of blunt, right? For those with the capacity to provide themselves with mechanical systems that allow for comfort. Part of the project for architects, perhaps, is to intervene in those discussions and to make discomfort more comfortable, maybe, right? Or to make it a bit more manageable and appealing. What are the design interventions that can allow that to play out? And, we see that in many different ways. I mean, we see that, it's not simply in architecture. Of course, there's aspects around clothing and other sorts of kind of second and third skins. But it's in part to say that the project for those that are, I'll just call them over-carbonized already, right? And I include myself, and you'll forgive me if I assume that many of you are in a similar position, or at least access to, even if you turn your thermostat down, you can turn it back up if you want to, right? So on the one hand, a set of interventions that can encourage those of us with the capacity to heat and cool ourselves to discourage that overuse or even use at all. As noted by Chris, the difficulty of selling less stuff, right? And I had a funny moment in Black Friday, right, last year when the Freitag, the backpacks and sort of wallets company, closed their store on Black Friday, right, because they didn't want to sell anything to anybody. And my first response was, oh man, that makes me really like the company. I want to buy more of their stuff. I was like, wait, hold on a second. That's not what I'm supposed to do. But they're also renting their bags and doing other things. But that's a bit neither here nor there. But it's to say that on the one hand, let's say the Northern Project or the Overcarbonized Project is designs for discomfort, and really directly so that the project in collaboration with colleagues and citizens and the sort of cultures of the global South, again, to speak very schematically, to recognize that these are populations that haven't benefited from a century of fossil fuels, or not in the same way, and quite unevenly. And as my colleague David Ness puts it, with sufficiency comes the premise of solidarity, right? That we're talking about reducing our demand, narrowing the stream of energy demand, again, in the north, in the overcarbonized spaces, so that the amount of carbon that we might come to terms with allowing ourselves to continue to emit would be focused on those environments where it's a question of survival rather than a question of luxury, right? Where it's a question of, if not even life or death, well-being, public health, right? Rather than, you know, the capacity to kind of walk around the house in the t-shirt in the middle of winter, for example. There's a hand.
See, Nick's added in a bit about existing buildings, and
yeah.
I don't know, in the first paragraph you wrote, Nick, you've talked about Pete Short's work on passive ventilation and comfort. Were you thinking about that in relation to existing buildings?
I think that's a question for Nick, right?
Yes, so I'm sort of firing that at Nick so he can elaborate on these questions.
Am I allowed to speak?
Yes.
I was just, I mean, my actual question was simply that I suppose following on what Daniel just said there, that if you like, the world's poor, including poor in Britain here, actually want quite a lot more resources. Thanks very much, you know. And so there is a real issue there about, and also existing buildings. I mean, that's the main problem, isn't it? You know, what do we do with existing buildings?
Yeah.
It's going to need a lot of resources, right? And I'm just saying that to do so without using, if you like, to use the words carbon violent materials, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult. I mean, it's bad enough just trying to do it, you know, far less trying to do it without carbon violent materials. I guess that's my point. That was it, really. And
yeah, no, I think that's, you know, I think you identify correctly, right? I mean, that again, part of this question of architecture aiming to kind of reframe itself around decarbonization, you know, is sensitive to a lot of these discussions around building moratoria, right? Or at least reducing the number of new buildings and working with the existing building stock. And, you know, a totally different set of skills and strategies and methods and tools and materials, et cetera, that not only are, you know, I mean, you know, part of the premise is that we need to train architects to, you know, around these questions of maintenance and care, around these questions of working with the existing building stock and effectively retrofitting them, you know, rather than the kind of signature forms, right, that so many architecture schools continue to be focused on. And, you know, because these are the urgent problems, right? And these are the urgent problems that are affecting people's lives every day. And the knowledge is there again, right? I mean, the knowledge is there in different corners in sociology and engineering and, you know, in many different sort of discussions. And part of what I kind of see in the future of the field, or hope, I guess, anticipate, aspire for in the future of the field is a means of sort of gathering that knowledge and seeing architects as really being a part of this discussion that's not about formal elaborations, you know, exclusively, right? But it's also about sort of, modes of intervention to really work with the existing building stock to reduce its carbon demand. You know, I also like to use this phrase, and sorry, I'll go to PL1 in just a second, but I use this phrase in some of my writings, thermal practices, right? And in many ways, the kind of first section in Brazil that I showed is the genesis of that, where I like to think that part of what's, you know, architects are designing a set of conditions, and then we're allowing or encouraging or scripting a way for the inhabitants to sort of use those conditions, right? So we have a design practice and they have a sort of practice of occupation. And how can those things kind of work together? How can those two practices work together to transform our sense of kind of thermal demand and carbon demand, right? So just to make it a little more complex, perhaps. But.
I see Puiwa's wanting to come in with a question.
Please.
So go for it. Puiwa.
Yeah. Thank you. In terms of achieving a certain comfort level, does achieving it through natural way has a higher kind of point against using mechanical intervention? Like when an architect is designing, usually how he choose or prioritize?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand completely. Let me take a stab, and you can let me know, clarify. I think one of the things, and what we saw in those the evidence for in those Brazilian buildings that had the air conditioners kind of stuck into their facades, were, well, two things. I mean, one that is a huge issue is that air conditioners do a really good job with humidity, right? And it's very difficult. There are some passive strategies for reducing humidity, right? Some non-mechanical methods. But it's much, it's a real kind of difficult space, right? A real kind of knot to untangle. Much of what impacts us negatively in overheated environments is the humidity, right? So that's sort of one piece, is just to kind of keep in mind that this isn't about kind of a new set of solutions, or but it's rather about just kind of recognizing the struggles that we're all about to face. The other thing that we recognize is that we're not, one of the discussions that often happens in the kind of renewable energy discussion is that, well, we can use solar energy, we can use wind power. It's never going to get us to the same energy demand as fossil fuels, right? And we could argue that perhaps, but if we just accept it for the moment, that's probably true, right? And that's probably okay. And so part of what we're talking about is that fossil fuels can kind of bring us up here and renewables sort of bring us down here. It doesn't mean that we suffer yet necessarily, right? But it does mean that we adjust and adapt and sort of change our aspirations to a different sort of life and a different sort of lifestyle and a different sort of future. Which is in part to say that, part of what's at stake is a disruption to our familiar economic patterns, right? I mean, it's a sort of broader sort of intervention in the social world that's not just about buildings, right? But that's to say that we're going to be living quite differently in the next year, 5 years, 20 years, 40 years, right? What I'm trying to encourage is for architects to really take that on, right? And to really recognize that finding ways to make that sort of reduced set of comfort expectations, let's say, manageable, pleasurable, sufficient, adequate, right, can go a long way, not only in changing the way that we design, right, but also sort of shifting the kind of pressures on energy demand more broadly. I didn't get too far into the kind of thinking about the darkness that's coming, right? I mean, I don't know. I have a hard time doing that at night, frankly. I can't sleep afterwards if I talk that one slide that I showed with kind of putting your age on that diagram and, thinking about my kids, et cetera, always gets a little difficult for me. But, we do know that the world that we know is going away, right? And whether it happens tomorrow or in 20 years or 50 years. And so I think part of what I'm hoping is that architects as agents of decarbonization can really kind of recapture cultural value. It's quite distinct from the one that we're familiar with today, right? But that's about sort of making people comfortable in less comfortable environments, right? That's about sort of providing a design intervention that allows us to kind of experience these spaces, not because they are bad approximations of a fossil fueled interior, right? But because they have their own sort of qualities and aspects and aptitudes. There's a lot of great physiological research about the value of experiencing different temperature and humidity over the day, over the seasons, et cetera, right? And I'm not an expert in that realm, but which is to say there could be more and more benefits that we don't even quite anticipate in the present.
I see Chris has asked another sort of follow-on question about health benefits of living a bit closer to the edge in terms of comfort.
I'm sorry, I'm just reading through it right now. Yeah. I mean, I don't have any direct references. I have a similar sort of intuition, let's say, right, and kind of set of experiences. But it also gets complicated, because one of the things, well, I mean, it's already complicated, but it gets more complicated. One of the things that comfort has done is articulated a sort of optimized work environment, right? If I can just sort of go there for a second, right? And if we're talking about less comfort, we're talking about less productivity, right? Both in a very general sense, a kind of population level analysis, right? But also at a kind of individual level. Maybe that's okay, right? Which is to say, do we want to be as productive as possible, even though we know that, so far we're still, there's still a relatively strong coupling between economic growth and environmental harm, right? I mean, there's some disruptions to that equation over the last couple of years.
Complicate that issue, Daniel.
Yeah.
I know in my advancing age, when I get myself comfortable, I tend to fall asleep, which is
right. So if you're uncomfortable, if you're a little cold, it keeps you awake, right?
Yeah.
So that's it's a different kind of different phase of optimized productivity. But I think that it's in part to say that we, the values that the sort of culture collectively holds, and I'm sure many people also hold other values, right? But around productivity, around accumulation of wealth, right? I mean, these are all sort of part of the same system relative to questions of comfort, questions of optimizing thermal interiors, questions of being able, again, to kind of walk into a certain type of room around the world and kind of get to work. I mean, yeah, maybe I'm not, I'm somewhat less advanced age, but I may be at the moment where I don't really mind being less productive, right? I mean, I see values of it for myself, psychologically, physiologically, socially, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, again, back to Kate Soper, I think a lot of the sort of degrowth economists and philosophers and theorists are trying to clarify that we're not talking about a worse living environment, right? If we reduce our productivity, if we reduce our GDP and some of these other things, but just a very different one, right? And one where those who accumulate wealth at a rapid pace will accumulate less, right? So there's plenty of people that are quite scared off by any sort of discussion of degrowth. There was a great conference in Brussels, I think it was in September, organized by the EU, by the European Commission, that it was called Beyond Growth, right? So what's to kind of, because degrowth has become this kind of very scary word, right? And every time I say it, I have to kind of back up a few steps, right? But it is the case that part of what we're talking about is this sort of system of economic productivity that our buildings have been designed for, right? And office buildings in particular we could look at, but we could generalize into other types. And so as we're thinking about different ways to design and inhabit these built environments, right, we're thinking about different expectations for our economic lives, for the lives of our friends and family and children. I'm involved I'm involved in a project in a museum in the Netherlands, which I don't want to give the details of because I'm not sure if we're going to pull it off, but hopefully come summer. And where they're thinking about how to reduce their carbon emissions. And one of the things that we've proposed to them is, maybe when it gets too hot and humid, if there's a heat wave, you shut down the museum during the day when the sun is out and reopen it in the evening or even like at midnight. I mean, this is the middle of summer in Amsterdam. It's cool, it's hip, it's hot, it's happening. Just keep the museum open for those environments and those experiences, requiring significantly less air conditioning, right? I mean, hopefully, of course, part of the problems with the heat dynamics in Amsterdam and Paris in particular is that the evenings aren't cooling off enough, right? So, maybe it's a failed mission already. But again, really reimagining and restructuring our expectations, right, of the world is part of what's on the table. And I don't pretend to know how architects can do that, right? But I'm just trying to sort of open up that box and sort of pose those questions on the premise that these are going to be the sorts of questions we're going to ask of ourselves and our clients and our collaborators and our communities, right, as we move forward.
Can I throw in just one final question, because I see time is marching on. We're going to have to draw to a close, but there's a kind of parallel on this comfort thing, I think, to do with the stage in your books where you're talking about all the MIT experiments, where you have physical experimentation. It's very hands-on and moving gradually into computerized predictive methodologies. And then there's a whole range from ecotech, for example, which you cite in your last book and is fairly universal in use, and students can use it. but you have much more advanced modeling systems, which basically people need some serious training in order to be able
Yeah.
to use it. And,
Yeah.
and architects shy away from that. So I suppose that, I don't know whether you have any comment about that. It's to do with what architects can deal with a team
Yeah.
reasonably easily, or think about even, you know, as they're designing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tricky one insofar as, you know, again, back to the kind of premise of sustainable design, you know, broadly considered, right? Which is that as a field and as an industry, you know, we have articulated a set of sort of paths of technological development that maintain a pretty serious carbon demand, right? I mean, there's, you know, I'm thinking of, say, a, you know, multi-pane glass panel on a curtain wall building, for example, right? And all the gases in between and the efficiencies that renders. Super intensive in embodied carbon, right? But also sort of providing some solutions in terms of some savings in energy efficiency. But I think that, you know, I mean, you're not talking about that directly, but I think I just kind of want to keep us really cautious, right? That of sort of questioning our assumptions, maybe, right? Or sort of questioning the kind of business as usual models, right? Because I think far too often we turn to, and, you know, and this is structural in institutions. I mean, we have our, you know, systems, my colleagues at UTS, I mean, that are brilliant and fabulous and interested in hybrid systems and all sorts of other things. But, you know, nonetheless, a lot of the grant funding comes for, you know, the robots that will make those glass panels built more efficiently. It's, you know, we're still kind of in this stream where the idea is to build more and gather more and produce more and more, right? And more stuff, more embodied energy in effect, right? So I think part of the kind of principle that, you know, recognizing the almost impossibility of it, right? Although, you know, we have our models, right? I mean, how can we do more with less, right? How can less be more, once again, right? How can we really kind of imagine a way of cultivating some of these other streams of technological engagement that are less dependent upon these heavy carbon interventions, right? And, you know, one of the things that I learned in effect from the Modern Architecture and Climate book, right, was that there was this kind of notion, you know, just before air conditioning kind of took over, if you will, in the 50s and 60s, right? Just before it became like a bit more readily available, a bit more economically viable. There was a kind of sense that it was cheating, right? That as an architect, you should be able to figure that out through design, right? And this is what the old guys who you mentioned and some of the influence of Le Corbusier's climatic work was really focused on, even some of the solar houses, although that was something of a different discussion. You know, but if you're relying upon air conditioning to keep the building comfortable, you know, you're just not doing your job as a designer, right? And thinking about the material systems and thinking about the natural ventilation and thinking about the site orientation and the urban surround and, you know, on and on and on. You know, we've lost that, right? I mean, to a large extent, there's plenty of people that are, I would say, still pretty focused on that. But so I think it's in that sense, a kind of set of principles, maybe more than a set of strategies, right? Which is that how do we begin to imagine a given project, whether it's a new build or a retrofit, you know, what are the terms through which we can imagine an approach to that project? Yeah, that kind of allows us to explore other technological trajectories, right? And again, I think that, you know, and to rely on engagement with the community and kind of rely on working with the client. And you know, I have some colleagues in Portugal. I was recently giving a workshop there, and we're putting together a grant where part of what we want to produce is a sort of user's manual for some of these social housing projects from the 50s and 60s that are facing a lot of climate challenges, especially as it heats up in the summer. And, you know, there's a certain number of design interventions, and you can change the windows and you can put up some shades and you can do some other things. But you also need to kind of, again, script the way of life in the interior, right? And kind of imagine how that can be pleasurable and beneficial and healthy, but according to a specific set of parameters and a specific set of activities. So I don't know what that user's manual is going to look like, but I think it's a kind of interesting direction to say, you know, we're not going to solve this through technology, but we're going to solve this through sort of behavior and engagement and sort of community development. So.
Well, I think that's a fabulous note on which to conclude What have I got here? Oh, we have another comment. I think we're going to have to, from Nicholas Schellenberg. Oh no, well, it's starting off with a thank you.
Should we take that one on? Or?
Something to read. I'm going to propose a massive vote of thanks to you.
Sure. Well, beautiful. Yeah, thank you.
For, I mean, making the time to, in your travels around Europe to stop off and give this presentation.
It's a pleasure.
And it's you've got a conversational style of presentation, which is terrific because it just leads in very naturally to us all having a conversation.
Yeah, well, it's all about the discussion from my perspective and
you have done. So. If I'm to make a recommendation to all the people who've been listening, I would go out and buy those 2 books. I think you'll enjoy them. And on that note, I will say thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation and thanks for all your attention and questions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for answering the questions.
Okay, yeah, good. Thanks a lot. Have a good evening.